a Skomer Summer. Mainly because I thought it sounded like a nice title, but in reality, I was more there in the autumn. So I arrived in mid-July and I left at the end of September. So the talk will mainly focus on sort of the autumn migration. Alongside that, I was also fortunate to go to Skomer the year before in 2020. I was on the island for a month. The island was actually closed that year to visitors. So I was extremely lucky to be one of only 4 people to be on the island. And I have included the odd sort of more exciting thing from that time, just to sort of add up to the talk. So a little bit about Skomer, for anyone that's not aware. It has roughly 250 visitors a day. So it is quite a tourist hotspot, especially compared to maybe the other islands in Wales. It can get quite busy. This year, though, due to COVID, it was reduced to 180 a day, but it can still get busy at times. Now, I was a long-term volunteer, so I was on the island, like I said, for about 2.5 months. We also do have short-term volunteers. So for anyone in the crowd that might see this talk tonight and think, I won't mind going there, you can volunteer for a week at a time, and they have 6 a week. So it's quite a good opportunity for anyone that's sort of looking for a bit of volunteering experience. And you can also stay as an overnight guest. So you don't have to go as a day visitor. So if anyone that does want to visit the island, there are quite a lot of different ways you can get there. So a little bit more about the island itself. So this is the location. So a lot of you will also know North Wales. Hopefully you can see my mouse. So Skomer is right on the Pembrokeshire coast, right in the sort of southwest corner of Wales, a bit more zoomed in. So here we have Skomer with a little blue icon. Just to the south is its sister island of Skokum. So this is an actual bird observatory, where Skomer itself isn't a sort of recognised bird observatory. And up to the north, it's also worth mentioning, this is Ramsey Island. So you sort of have these sort of 3 islands all in a line. And this big bay here is known as St. Bride's Bay. This is actually a very deep bay. It's a lot deeper than a lot of people think, and it is quite a good place for sort of fish and sea life. And as a result, this area of Pembrokeshire is a national park, so it all makes part of the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park. Now here is a satellite picture of Skomer Island, and here is not the best map. Unfortunately, it was the best map I could find. It is a bit blurry, but hopefully you can get an okay idea of some of the sort of main features on the island. So in the centre of the island, you have the farm. This is where all the guests stay, or the overnight guests, or the volunteers. This is where I stayed. This is sort of a bit more sheltered, and there's a few sort of small bushes around here, so it's quite a good place to look for any migrating birds. There's also a few ponds on the island. Now, North Pond is probably the best pond. It's sort of quite a shallow pond. It's the largest. Over the other side, you have another pond called Green Pond. Now, this is extremely deep. It's about 2 meters, but it was man-made. And as a result, it doesn't really do much for its bird life. It's a bit too deep and a bit overgrown for birds. However, it does sort of this sort of natural river, as you can sort of make out from North Pond to Green Pond. As a result, is very fertile. And this sort of strip has a lot of sort of willow trees growing. So it's sort of one of the best places on the island to sort of look for any migrating birds. And then to the south of the island, you have another pond known as Morimia. Now, when I arrived on the island, this was bone dry, and it never actually got any water the whole time I was there. So it wasn't really a very good, successful pond. However, there was a hide that overlooks the pond, and the hide is surrounded by bushes. And it was actually quite surprising that if you sat in the hide long enough, birds would come out. Now, another thing worth mentioning, that the island has sort of these designated paths. And I will sort of go on to that a little bit later and explain exactly why there are sort of marked paths on the island. Also, you might just be able to read this. The island is roughly 4 miles all the way around. And it says there it takes about 3 hours. Another thing that I'm just going to mention very quickly is this island here. So in between Skomer and the mainland, there's another small island called Middlehome. So it's known as Middlehome, and I will talk about this a little bit later and its sort of significance towards bird migration. So this, unfortunately, was one of the only photos I actually got of the scenery on Skomer. I seem to take too many photos of the bird life and not enough of the scenery. However, it does indicate what I was trying to sort of explain, that this is basically the habitat of Skomer. It is a bit barren. There are the odd sort of willow and alder trees. There's the odd sort of clump of bramble. But really, once you get into July, the island is covered in bracken. You do have a little bit of wood sage and a bit of red campion, but it's basically bracken all the way over. And this obviously does make it quite hard if you are bird watching on the island, because there's basically places for birds to hide everywhere. The whole island, a bird could hide anywhere. So it can make bird watching quite difficult when you've got so much habitat to look through. However, if you do visit in sort of April, May time, the island is completely covered in bluebells and it looks stunning. However, I may have been to Skomer volunteering, I think 6 times now, if you count the times I've been as a weekly volunteer, and I've still never been early enough in the year to see the bluebells. Every time I've gone, it just looks like a bracken wilderness. So a bit more about sort of some of the main sort of species that draw people to the island, the seabirds. So this is definitely the bird that everyone comes to see, puffins. This is what brings in the tourists. This is what brings in the money. Now, it is a very good place to see puffins. There's roughly 17,000 pairs on the island. And this year, they actually had quite a late breeding season. The last bird to come in with fish was seen on the 15th of August, which is about 3 weeks later than the year before. So to the enjoyment of quite a lot of visitors, normally my job in sort of July, early August was kind of to politely to explain to people that unfortunately you've missed the puffins and you've come too late. However, fortunately this year, they kind of had a bit of a later breeding season. And as a result, a lot more people were able to see them. I also did include this photo, mainly to indicate to anyone that is yet to see a puffin exactly how small they are. You can just about make out how small it is by the people's legs. And also as a way of showing sort of how tame they are on the island. Now, I don't really like using the word tame. I think it's not really a very good word because they aren't tame. They're more tolerant. They're more tolerant to humans. They have got to know humans and they're not really that scared of us anymore. Now, if you get too close, they will fly away. So it's always good to give them a bit of space, but they've kind of got to a place now where they're kind of happy to sort of, as long as you keep your distance, a meter or so, they will happily go about their life. Now, obviously, puffins aren't the only seabird on Skomer. You have other auk species, such as the razorbill. There's around 3,500 to 4,000 pairs of razorbill, so quite a healthy population. And also guillemots. Now, there's actually incredibly 14,500 pairs of guillemots. However, you don't really notice that when you visit. So Skomer is quite a raised island. It's very raised up. It's got a lot of sheer cliffs, basically all the way around it. There's not too many beaches or bays, especially none that you can actually get to. So there are a lot of good habitat for guillemots. However, a lot of them, it's very hard to see them. So you don't really realize how many guillemots are breeding on the island until you go around on a boat and realize that they sort of, there's little colonies dotted all the way around. Now, all these auks do help bring in the odd predator, including these guys, the peregrines. Now, there's quite a healthy population on Skomer. There's 3 pairs bred this year. They fledged at least 4 young. However, we weren't exactly too sure due to the issues with an early pair fledging 1 young early on, and that young just spending the whole time flying around the island and resulting in perhaps a bit of difficulty working out if it was a new fledgling or one from the earlier brood. Now, my favourite seabird on the island is probably these guys, the former. Now, you might be quite surprised to know that Skomer actually has the largest colony of formers in Wales. It has 568 pairs. However, I do feel that could possibly be biased because on the mainland, it's quite difficult. Like, where do you start a colony and stop a colony? And so obviously Skomer having quite a long coastline, if you count some areas of Anglesey in the same area, it possibly has the same amount. The Front Island especially, it does actually have the largest colony of 568 pairs. And you do get really nice views of them. And I make no apology for adding an extra photo of a former because I do really like them. Also, kittiwakes. Now, obviously, a lot of people will probably no doubt know that kittiwakes aren't having the best time recently. However, Skomer does have a relatively healthy population. It has about 1,500 pairs breeding on the island. And this year did seem to be quite a good year for them. Now, it is quite early on. The numbers haven't necessarily been analysed fully. We're not too sure whether or not what we were seeing was actually backed up with sort of scientific surveys. But there did seem to be a good number of juvenile birds around. Quite a lot of pairs seem to be quite successful, especially because a few years ago, there were a few colonies that actually fledged no young. So just seeing sort of free-flying juvenile hopefully indicates that perhaps the kittiwake had quite a good year. And I think they definitely do need a bit of success. So that was always quite nice to see a few sort of flying juveniles flying around. Other gull species on the island, herring gull obviously breed on the island. Now there's 297 pairs of herring gull. That might not really mean much to most people, nearly 300 pairs. However, there's 5,500 pairs of these guys, the lesser black-backed gull. So herring gulls are well and truly outnumbered. And quite a lot of these were carrying wings. And from that, we knew that a lot of these would fly down to Portugal or Spanish coast to spend the winter. So that's mostly where the ones we were getting come from. Now, the final gull species to breed on the island is also the UK's largest and the world's largest, the great black-backed gull. And there's around 108 pairs of great black-backed gull around the island. Now, a few other seabirds that breed on the island that's worth mentioning are, for example, shags. Now, it's actually quite interesting, shags and cormorants on Skomer, because they're actually quite a rare breeder. Now, we think it's because the cliff faces are extremely steep, and though they have sort of big enough ledges for guillemots, they don't really have any sort of like cracks and caves a bit like this one, where shags can breed. Now, this photo, I must admit, was actually taken on Bardsey, because there actually is only 3 to 6 pairs of shag on the island. I think this year there's about 4. So they are actually quite a rare bird. There's not many pairs. And cormorants, there was only 2 pairs this year. So, surprisingly, not as many shags and cormorants as you expect. Another seabird that breeds and is even harder to see and also to count are these, the storm petrels. Now, obviously, this one was done under license during ringing. But no one really knows how many actually breed on Skomer. They think roughly around 200 pairs breed, but due to mostly breeding in very inaccessible areas, they're very difficult to count and sort of get to. Now, a lot of people that come to Skomer will come to see puffins. It is a draw. It's what people really want to see. But Skomer, even though it has all these different seabird species, is most important for one, and that is the Manx shearwater. Now, I don't know if anyone, some of you might be aware, but Skomer actually is the largest colony of Manx shearwaters in the world, and it has a quarter of the whole world's population of Manx shearwater. Now, that works out to roughly 350,000 pairs. It is a ridiculous, mind-blowing number. It's really hard to get your head around, because if you sort of double that up and add all their young, you're talking at least 1 million, if not more, birds come to the island. And obviously, with all the failed breeders that sort of visit and leave, maybe up to sort of 1.5 million birds actually sort of go around the Skomer coast, especially when you add on sort of the birds on Skocum and Ramsey nearby. So there are a ridiculous amount of Manx shearwaters. Now, you may have remembered at the start, I said about the paths on Skomer and how there's designated paths. Now, the reason for this is due to burrows. There are burrows everywhere. Anywhere that isn't a path is burrowed. Now, obviously, Manx shearwaters breed in burrows alongside puffins. So you have 2 sort of burrow nesting species, and because their burrows are everywhere, this was a really big challenge. Sort of any visitor that comes to the island trying to explain to them to stay on the paths at all times. But it also made quite a big challenge for us because it meant that it was quite difficult to bird on the island. You're so used to seeing a bird in the bush. It flies in deep into the bush. You didn't really get a very good view, or you might walk a bit closer and see if you can get a better view of it. Whereas on Skomer, you're not allowed to really go off the paths. So if a bird flies into a distant bush, you either have to sit miles away, hoping it comes back out, or sort of just ignore it and hope it was nothing too rare. So obviously, it's incredible that there's this many birds, and Skomer is so important for the Manx shearwater. However, it did make it sometimes a little bit annoying that some of the good habitat was inaccessible. Now, because there's so many birds, you do get a lot of birds like this one that goes out during the day. Now, Manx shearwaters are actually quite unusual because they actually leave their young. So the parents come back at night, they feed their young, and then they leave again and only come back at night. And then for the last roughly 10 days, the adults don't come back. They starve their young. Now, the reason for this is Manx shearwaters basically get overfed. They're too fat to fly. Sometimes they're even too fat to get out of their burrow. So the parents leave them. They basically starve them out. Manx shearwaters will then turn their sort of fat into muscle. And roughly within 10 days, they'll then leave the island. Now, it is a bit amazing how somehow this Manx shearwater chick here will somehow get all the way to Argentina all by itself without following anyone. But that does mean that you have lots of young birds that are basically wandering around, not knowing what they're doing. Now, what they'll do during that 10 days, they'll come out of their burrow, they'll do a bit of wing flapping, they'll have a bit of a wander around, a bit of explore, try and build up those flight muscles. And then when it starts to get light again, they then try and go back into their burrows. However, even though they can somehow make it to the Argentine coast to winter, they never seem to be able to find their burrows again. And they end up finding them everywhere. So if you do visit the island in September, you might be lucky enough to see Manx shearwaters just about anywhere. You know, the toilets, the paths, but you know, the picnic areas, literally anywhere you'll go in, there'll just be Manx shearwaters running around. And this obviously is a very good food source for example, for example, great blackback gulls, you know, 108 pairs on the island, but that increases to about 500, if not more, birds in the late autumn, in sort of September time, when the Manx shearwaters fledge. Also, herring gulls will have a go at a Manx shearwater. However, perhaps a little bit more interestingly, these guys, the raven. Now, there's only about 10 pairs of raven really on Skomer in a year. However, once you get to sort of early September, their numbers skyrocket. So a lot of birds will come over from the mainland and basically just to feed on Manx shearwaters. It's the only sort of main food source on the island in September. And Skomer is probably one of the best places actually in in the UK, as it were, to actually see ravens. Their numbers are ridiculous. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds on the island, and sort of there's always one in the sky. And you know, it's not really unusual if like 100 fly over in the morning, sort of just circling around looking for sort of any sort of Manx shearwater chicks that were unfortunate enough not to be able to get back into their burrows in time. So it's sort of quite a cool spectacle to see all these ravens arriving on the island. But it's not just ravens that get drawn in from the mainland to look for Manx shearwaters. Another bird was this, red kites. Now, obviously, a lot of you will know that red kites have done quite well in Wales, and they've now really increased in numbers. However, on Skomer, they're actually still not that common. You usually get less than 10 a year. We only actually had 6 records this autumn. However, we did get a couple of birds, including this one, that you spent basically the whole day flying around the island picking up dead Manx shearwaters. Now, some of you will probably be aware that red kites are scavengers. They will, you know, eat dead animals regularly. So I do wonder whether or not, you know, red kites, as they sort of get to know Skomer, you know, birds like this that come and visit, they might realize that there is a very good food source for them. And I'm sort of picturing maybe in sort of, you know, 10 years time, flocks and flocks of red kites, a bit like the raven, coming over to feed. However, unlike the raven, they do have quite a hard time when they come. Here, 2 jackdaws were trying to scare this one away. So they do get mobbed a bit too much. So maybe that will be enough to scare them off. Now, another sort of burrowing species alongside the puffin and the Manx shearwater that maybe you might be a little bit surprised to know about was on Skomer are these rabbits. Now, it is quite surprising when people come and they see rabbits, but they were introduced. They were introduced for fur farming in the medieval times. They've been on the island for a very long time. And because they were introduced, they're not all sort of typical they're not all typical brown rabbits like this one. We do have quite a lot of black ones and white ones and ginger ones. So you do get sort of a full range. I like to call them pet colored rabbits. Unfortunately, I didn't actually take many photos of rabbits, and this was actually the only photo I got. However, there is sort of a discussion of whether or not these rabbits do help. They do possibly provide better burrows for Manx shearwaters because they burrow a lot deeper than a Manx shearwater. So rabbits, obviously, because they have come from the mainland, they're used to having to sort of cope with sort of large mammals like humans. They dig a lot deeper burrows than the Manx shearwaters that are sort of not used to sharing the island with any large mammal whatsoever. So whereas a Manx shearwater burrow is sort of only a few centimeters deep sometimes, and obviously extremely fragile if you step on it, rabbits will dig a lot deeper. So they possibly do help Manx shearwaters by providing them with a much more stable home. And they also do help to bring in a lot of buzzards. Now, another prey item, and a bit more of an exciting one, is this guy. Now, to sort of the untrained eye, this might look like a stereotypical bankfold, but it actually is its own subspecies. So this is known as the Scover Bowl. Now, it was once considered a separate species, but more recent studies has decided that it actually is a separate species. As far as I'm aware, I believe it's slightly larger and darker than bank bowls on the mainland. Alongside this, Skomer also is home to wood mice, pygmy shrew, and common shrew. Now, these Skomer Bowls, as it were, are actually extremely common. There's very, very high population on the island. I'm pretty sure I remember correctly that they actually are a lot higher density on Skomer than bank voles normally are found on the mainland, and that was sort of another reason why they were considered a subspecies, because they can live in much higher densities. Now, this one, as you can see, was in a trap, and this was actually in my bedroom. So they do get just about everywhere. I think I managed to catch 3 in my room at one night before I finally found the hole that they were coming in from. And luckily, this one posed long enough for a photo. But obviously, all this sort of food and rodents do help to bring in a few exciting bird species, including this guy, short-eared owls. So as I said, obviously Skomer is sort of mainly covered in sort of either wildflowers or bracken. So it's quite good habitat for hunting owls and breeding owls. And as a result, there are, well, up to 5 pairs of short-eared owl in recent years. This year was a good year. They did actually have 5 pairs, and they were relatively successful. So this was a photo taken by the visitor officer during a breeding bird survey of a lovely little cute chick. I sort of had to include that little cute chick. Now, for anyone that may have visited Skomer in the past, sort of quite a few years ago now, but may have thought that little owls were also on the island. Now, they used to be quite common on the island and quite easy to see. There was a well-known pair that used to breed in the ward, and a lot of visitors used to come and see the little owl. Unfortunately, these are now extinct, so they've been extinct since 2016. And it's quite hard to say whether or not this is a good thing or not, because these little owls were known to hunt storm petrels. So it possibly isn't the end of the world that little owls are now extinct on Skomer. Now, another bird species that is brought in by all these voles are kestrels. Now, interestingly, kestrels don't actually breed on Skomer. However, in sort of the late August, early September, you get quite large numbers. We had at least 6 in the sky at once. However, we're not too sure exactly how many were present on the island at once. Obviously, it can't be easy to count. But, you know, a lot of people don't necessarily consider kestrels as a migrating species, but they were migrating onto the island sort of in the late summer. Another species that arrived in the late summer to also feed on the voles were these guys, Marsh Harriers. Now, Marsh Harriers have seen quite a large increase in Pembrokeshire in the last few years. You go back maybe as few as 5 years ago, they were quite a rare species on Skomer. You get the odd one passing through on migration. Now we had at least 3, if not 4, juvenile birds that were spent the whole of sort of August and September just flying around hunting voles. We did also have a wing-tagged female that had come from Norfolk, so that was quite interesting to sort of learn where these birds were coming from. And that one actually was a bit more interesting because it actually left Skomer a few times and it would come backwards and forwards from the mainland. So it kind of suggests that these birds were quite comfortable just sort of flying around. And I think it also visited Skomer as well. So it sort of was doing full loops of the Pembrokeshire coast. So marsh harriers are quite a nice bird to see and quite an easy bird to see actually. Come August, there was basically always one in the sky. Now, another breeding species that I don't want to forget are choughs. Now, for a lot of you in North Wales, they might not be as exciting, but they obviously are still quite a rare species, and a lot of visitors do come hoping to see them, especially once the seabirds have gone. There's only actually 5 pairs breed on Skomer. However, in the sort of late autumn, September time, we did get quite a lot coming across from the mainland. We've got up to 30 birds in some of the roosts on the island, so they do get quite a big influx. Now, for anyone that's sort of a keen colour ring finder and enjoys going out and looking for colour ring birds, the Pembrokeshire coast choughs is not a good thing, because after looking at God knows how many chough legs trying to find a colour ring bird, I only managed to find one, and even then it flew off before I could get its combination. Whereas in North Wales, it's normally trying to find the non-colouring birds. So there's not a lot less studies going on in sort of South Wales. Now, I've included this next bird, even though I hadn't seen it, because I thought it was quite exciting. So this is a tree sparrow. Now, this photo was actually taken at Bempton. However, tree sparrows actually bred on Skomer in 2020. So 2 years ago, the island was completely shut for visitors. There was no visitors the whole year due to COVID. And this obviously did have an impact on the wildlife. No one really knows yet exactly how much of an impact it had in Skomer. However, these guys did come in. So tree sparrow bred for the first time, I think, in like 100 years. And they actually bred in a house martin box near the toilets at the farm. Now, I think it's quite safe to say that if the island was open normally and, you know, you're getting 200 visitors a day, these tree sparrows would not have bred in a box above the toilets. They definitely would have been scared off. So perhaps, you know, one positive of COVID definitely was that tree sparrows did successfully breed. And it is always gives you that sort of, you never know, you know, if you leave a place, who knows what might arrive. And especially because tree sparrows are so rare in Wales, as it were, you didn't really ever expect them to turn up on Skomer. Now, it's also worth mentioning that, as you can see in this photo here, there is actually a house martin in this box. So in 2020, tree sparrows bred on the island for the first time in about 100 years in a house martin box. In 2021, last year, house martins bred in a house martin box. They actually bred in a different box to the tree sparrow, but it was only a few boxes down. And that was actually the first ever record of house martins breeding on Skomer. Now, these boxes have only been up for a few years. So it does kind of indicate that, you know, that sort of well-known thing of build it and they will come. And it obviously did work in this case. Another species that did quite well this year is this showduck. Now, unfortunately, I seem to have not taken any photos or couldn't find my own photos, so I had to borrow this one. Now, showducks on Skomer don't normally have a very good time, so I definitely thought it was worth giving this guy a little mention. So normally, it's a case of how many hours a showduck chick will survive rather than how many days. Obviously, being on an island where you've got up to 10,000 gulls flying around, it's quite difficult if you're a little flightless showduck chick. However, somehow, this showduck chick managed to buck the trend and managed to actually fledge. It grew up, somehow avoided all the girls, got big enough so it could fly. And I think that was at least 10 years since any successful breeding of showduck. So I thought this guy definitely deserved a bit of a shout out. Now, a few other species that breed on Skomer that are perhaps sort of worth mentioning, which might surprise a few of you and are perhaps not ideal, are things like these. So Canada geese actually breed on Skomer. They've only recently arrived, but they sort of, I think, due to the fact there's absolutely no land predators, nothing whatsoever, they do quite well. Another species that breeds on Skomer that definitely is a surprise to a lot of visitors that come. You get them coming confused, going, I think I've seen this sort of like a pheasant, a chicken, I don't know what it is. But actually pheasants do actually breed on Skomer. Now, going back, I explained about middle homes, so that little sort of very small island between Skomer and the mainland. And it's thought that middle home, if it wasn't there, Skomer's bird life would be a lot different. So Skocum is a lot further out to sea than Skomer, not that much further, but it is a little bit further out. It doesn't have sort of anything in between it and the mainland, whereas Skomer does have middle home. And it is thought that these pheasants they did come by themselves and they used middle home as like a stepping stone. So it sort of acts as a stepping stone. Also, things like magpies breed on Skomer and they don't breed on Skocum. So again, it's thought that because there is that sort of middle island, it kind of helps to sort of bring sort of certain bird species across that wouldn't normally come. So yeah, pheasants actually do breed on Skomer. Now, going off birds for a few seconds, it's worth mentioning these two. So on the left, you have the common frog, and on the right, you have the toad. Now, you might be quite surprised that these have kind of made it into the talk, but the main reason is they are just ridiculously common. There are toads everywhere. So at night time, we always tell people that go out to look at the Manx shearwaters, obviously to use red light, not to disturb Manx shearwaters, but to basically always have a torch on. Now, this isn't in case you accidentally step on a Manx shearwater, because really it's going to be quite difficult to do. They normally will either make a sound, they'll just sort of flap their wings to try and get away from you, and you'll know where they're there. But it's actually because you don't want to step on a toad or a frog. Now, I think in about a 500-meter stretch across the island, in one night we counted 121 frogs and 121 toads and about 20 frogs. And so anyone in the crowd that might be looking for a project to do, perhaps if you have any students, definitely would say that there definitely needs to be some sort of study to work out exactly how many both toads and frogs on the island, because it does seem to be extremely densely populated, because they were just on the path. There was obviously more probably off the path. And it is thought that due to having maybe 1 million burrows across the island, once you count all the rabbits, the puffins, the Manx shearwaters, and old Manx shearwater burrows, that these toads actually go into the burrows at night, during the day, to sort of shelter away from the sun. So that's why they do so well. So they sort of hide away in the burrows of the day and come back out at night. So sort of moving on, sort of the migration period, as it were. So the first sort of bird we talk about is the wheatear. Now, wheatears sort of help to sort of indicate a problem whilst birding watching on an island. So one of the important things that a lot of people try and, places like Skomer, but also a lot of bird observatories in Wales and across the UK, they try and record migration. So every day on Skomer Island, they do a bird log, where everyone that stays on the island gets together and talks about what's been seen on the island. Any of you that might have visited places like Bardsey or Skocum will also do something extremely similar. And that is basically as a way of recording migration, recording what's passing through the island, what's arriving. And wheatears, along with a few other species, do pose quite a slight problem, because there's around 20 to 25 pairs breeding on the island. So once you get to the late summer, you've probably got 100 wheatears at least flying around the island. So every day, it's very difficult to work out if any of these are new arrivals, if it's just a breeding bird, because unless you count more than 100, you don't know whether or not these are new arrivals or not. However, it does kind of help when you get birds like this one that decided to go into the garden of the farm, miles away from any wheatear territories. So as a result, when you're birding on sort of any sort of migration hotspot, the best way to sort of work out whether or not a bird is a breeding species, local breeder, or more likely to be a migrant is perhaps where it is. Is it somewhere that you don't normally see a wheatear, let's say a few weeks before? Another bird that breeds on the island but gets a lot more commoner during migration are swallows. So there's less than 10 pairs actually breed on Skomer. But this year they did have quite a good year. I don't know if anyone else noticed any good breeding, sort of successful breeding of swallows. But on Skomer, one pair itself actually had 4 broods. So I think it fed something like 16 or 17 young. So it did pretty well. So you did get quite a lot of these sort of young birds flying around. Now, this is the first of a few graphs I have added in, sort of help sort of indicate sort of swallow numbers and sort of other bird numbers. So here you have in blue is August, and then yellow is September. So this kind of indicates roughly when swallows are passing through the island. However, these numbers aren't necessarily fully accurate because, for example, days of 0 probably days of bad weather, where it's pretty rainy all day, so we didn't really get a good count. However, it was worth mentioning that swallows seem to move in sort of clear conditions, are sort of the best. Sort of clear weather with sort of a light sort of southerly, southwesterly headwind seem to be the best weather for swallows. However, the day that we managed to get, I think it was 1300 this day on the 22nd, it was actually the complete opposite. It was sort of a calmish day, but it was cloudy, and suddenly the wind started to pick up, it started to rain, and swallows were just flooding through. I think I counted 1,000 in an hour, and then unfortunately had to go and do other jobs on the island that day, so I had to stop. So no doubt, maybe up to 10,000 swallows passed through that day. So it's sort of the best thing. I feel like if you are birding anywhere like Skomer or any sort of bird watching during migration period, especially on the coast, it's very hard to predict. Sometimes a day that sort of, the weather turns and it looks like there's not going to be many birds, suddenly the sky's full of them, because presumably these swallows were all out in the Irish Sea and all just sort of decided to shoot straight in and fly inland because they were sort of all heading back on towards the mainland. So you sort of never know, as it were. So I have already mentioned house martins. Obviously, they bred for the first time this year. However, we did get quite a big influx during migration. Nothing really close to swallows. So swallows are definitely the most common species, sort of hirundine species. We did have some quite good days of sort of getting into sort of double figures. For example, I think the best day was 62 on the 15th of September. And sand martins also obviously passed through. In slightly better numbers than house martin. I always find it's quite strange that house martins, those usually see them quite commonly sort of around your local town. There seems to be always less on migration, and swallows always seem to be winning, and then it's usually sand martins and then house martins. So sand martins peaked at 165 on the 7th of September. So warblers, so that's obviously a large part of the autumn migration is warblers. However, on places like Skomer, we actually do get them all the time. So Willow Warbler and Chiffchaff were basically present throughout the whole year. There's not really many days sort of in the sort of spring to summer that we don't have them. You get the odd bird over summering, including this bird, which unfortunately was a bit battered. As you can see, it sort of, they had a bit of a hard time and spent the whole of June and July just flying around the island. Hopefully it managed to get off. And here is a sort of another graph, again, having September in yellow, August in blue, and red is July, showing sort of Chiffchaff numbers and how they fluctuate during the autumn migration. Now, the best time seems to always be the last week of August and the start of September. That is sort of the time when most things seem to be moving. And it's also worth just looking at this here. So it goes 2, 4, 6, 8. So Willow Warbler, another sort of species that passes through the island in really good numbers. And here is the sort of the same graph for Chiffchaff, but for Willow Warbler. And as you can see, where it was Chiffchaff was 2, 4, 6, 8. Willow Warbler is 20, 40, 60, 80. You get, well, 10 times the number of Willow Warbler to Chiffchaffs. They are way more common. And to be honest, a lot of these counts were a lot of way underestimates. You know, you walk around, you count every Willow Warbler you see, and you know that there are more, but it's just basically, there was at least this many each day. There was no doubt more. And all these sort of hirundines and warblers do help to bring in birds like this, sparrowhawks. We had 3 sparrowhawks that spent sort of late August, early September flying around the island, causing mayhem. They were a very big nuisance, I must say. You go and check a sort of a secluded bush to see if there's any warblers or anything in it hiding, and suddenly a sparrowhawk will fly out of it. Or even worse, you're on your way down to check some bushes and a sparrowhawk flies in just before you get there, flushes everything, and then you have to wait sort of 15, 20 minutes before any bird decides to show its face again. So obviously always nice to see, but they were a bit of a pain. So swifts, now we did see an okay number of swifts on Skomer, but on the west coast seems to never get anywhere near the numbers you get along the east coast. Here is sort of the graph for sort of mid-July after I arrived through to sort of the end of the year. As you can see, once I arrived, we had quite big movement sort of towards the end of July. So that was sort of the main movement of swifts happened sort of the last few weeks of July. It then went extremely quiet, but interestingly, we just kept getting the odd swift. So we had one on the 3rd of August, and then had a few more. We had one that presumably was the same bird on the 24th, 23rd, and 24th of August. And it was one of those things where we were like, will that be the last swift of the year? Then we got one on the 3rd of September, got one on the 4th of September, then the 7th of September, and the last one was actually the 13th of September. Now, we weren't too sure exactly. However, Skomer, I think, had one on the 14th of September. I think it was something like their second latest ever. So there's no doubt that was possibly one of the latest ever swifts to be recorded on Skomer. So they did seem to some reason hang around a bit longer than they normally do. And that was actually this bird that I took a photo of. And the main reason I got quite a nice photo was because I was a bit scared it could be pallid, but it did turn out it was just a common swift. So obviously when you get in September, it's always worth double checking these things. Another bird that's quite an early mover, a bit like the swift, is cuckoos. Now, we're not too sure whether or not cuckoos breed on Skomer. We think this one might have done. So this one spent 4 days on the island, at least, from the 12th to the 16th of July. And it seems to have this sort of meadow pipit nearby. And the meadow pipit didn't actually feed it, but it did seem to be flying around it. So we possibly think it may have bred, especially because the only other cuckoo we got in the autumn was over a month later on the 25th of August. So that perhaps suggests that this was actually a local breeder, and the one in late August was one that had come from elsewhere. Now, a bird that many people might be actually quite surprised that I've included on sort of a migration tour, it is black-headed gulls. But they do move in very high numbers. Late July, early August seems to be the best time You've got large movements, mainly on clear days, like this one. They sort of pass straight over, sort of about 50-50 split would go over the middle of the island and the rest would sort of go round it. But they definitely seem sort of warm days, they'd sort of be passing through, and mainly we're going north. And the majority were juveniles, but there was the odd sort of nice adult like this one. And where you have black-headed gulls, it's always worth sort of scanning through them. And you never know, there might be a few of these med gulls. Now, I thought when I was making this talk that med gulls were actually quite common on Skomer this year. I thought we got quite a few. Turned out we only got 3. So I think it was something like 500 black-headed gulls were recorded this year and only 3 med gulls. So it was a very low percentage of med gulls. And for any sort of eagle-eyed people in the crowd, you may think that this med gull looks more like winter plumage rather than summer plumage. That's because this one was actually taken on the island. The main reason is the only photo of a med gull I actually managed on Skomer is this one, which I think a lot of people would agree is a proper record shot. But it's quite clear that it's sort of a full adult, nice summer plumage med gull. Another species that might surprise people that is actually a migrant is collared dove. So collared doves do migrate. And this is another great reason when you're living on an island and spending a large amount of time on an island, because you know exactly what breeds. You know, in June, July, then we know what birds were there. We know what birds were breeding. So then when you get to sort of late July, early August, and things like this turn up, you know that it must have flown in from the mainland. And it's always nice, you know, a bit of a surprise when a collared dove turned up. They sort of were a bit irregular, the odd one for throughout August and September. But I felt like another thing on the mainland, you know, collared doves are everywhere. You don't necessarily give them a second look. However, when you're sort of on somewhere and you haven't seen one in a few weeks and one turns up, you definitely do give them that sort of second look and watch them a bit more than perhaps you normally would, and realise that birds like the dove are actually quite a pretty bird that perhaps you sort of a bit overlooked on the mainland. Now, like I said, with the Whitetails, the best way to work out if it was a local breeder or perhaps more likely to be a migrant was where it is. And that can definitely be said for these reed warblers. I think it may have, oh yeah, there we go. So we did get quite a few reed warblers passing through, and I feel like this is always an enjoyment whilst bird watching an island. They might not be the rarest thing in the world, but when you see reed warblers flying around bushes in a garden, it's a lot different to where you normally see them in a reed bed. So that was always quite sort of nice to see a bird perhaps where it shouldn't be, in slightly different habitat to where you normally expect to see them. Now, I don't actually have any photos of blackcaps. It is also worth mentioning that they seem to have quite a bad year this year. They seem very late moving and then didn't really have very high numbers. So in August, we only had the odd record. We were really struggling to see blackcaps. But mid-September, we had quite a big push. So, you know, we're getting the odd blackcap a day. And I think on the 5th of September, we had 13. So it did seem to increase, but I don't know if anyone else noticed that blackcaps seem to be quite delayed this year in their migration. Alongside that, we did get the odd garden warbler. They're always a bit difficult to see on sort of autumn migration. Now, a bird that was the complete opposite to blackcaps, as it were, and a bird that normally you don't necessarily see that much. But when you go to somewhere like Skomer, somewhere where they are migrating through, you get much better views and you see a lot more than you'd sort of expect, are these spotted flycatchers. And these were, to be honest, everywhere. They were actually quite a common bird. Now, yeah, it was surprising actually. I did not expect to see them that much. But you know, most days there was a spotted flycatcher, and you know, you look out the window and there's sort of some days there'll be up to sort of 5 or 6 sat on this one fence just behind the farm. So it's always nice to see them. And where obviously you have spotted flycatchers, you also get these pied flycatchers. And we did get quite good numbers of pied flycatcher. Actually, it was quite a good year for pied flycatcher, it seemed. Quite a lot stopping off. So here is another graph. I quite like this one. It kind of shows the difference between spotted and pied flycatcher numbers. So as you can see, we seem to get a lot more spotted flycatchers. And some days, you know, we're getting 20 plus quite regularly. And basically had them almost daily. Pied flycatchers were a bit lower in number, but still got 5 on some days. So definitely sort of when you're on an island like this, even if you don't see any like big rarities, it's always nice to see sort of these sort of uncommon species a lot more regularly. So that was always a nice sort of thing to look at. Now, obviously, I wouldn't couldn't necessarily do a talk on bird migration without dipping out of birds every now and then. So obviously it's not just birds that pass through. We also have insects like painted ladies. These didn't seem to have a very good year, but they were seen daily on the island, but definitely not in very high numbers. So it wasn't really a very good year for painted lady. Now, when you're on an island, you also need to be careful because a lot of people will walk around, they will check the bushes, and they won't necessarily look up. And that is really where most of the birds are. Birds are passing through. They're only going to stop on the island or stop anywhere if they need to. If they need to have a rest, they need to get food and replenish their sort of supplies. So most of the birds you get are just passing straight over. They're using Skomer as a landmark on their sort of southbound migration. And this is especially true for these tree pipits. Now, I don't know if anyone else sort of realised, but it seemed to be quite a calm, nice sort of autumn. September and August was actually quite calm. We didn't get a lot of windy weather, didn't get that much rain. So most days were like this one, full sun, quite calm, and this was perfect weather for tree pipit. So this year we actually recorded 72 tree pipits migrating through Skomer. It was the best year on record, I think. I'm right in saying that. And compare that to 2020, when I was on the island for a month, I think we only had 3. And that was basically because the weather was completely opposite. So that's always one thing to consider, that yes, you know, you visit a migration hotspot like Skomer during sort of peak migration, August or September, but the weather does play the biggest role in whether or not you're actually going to see anything. And one year it can be really windy and you only get the odd tree pipit. The next year it's really calm and they're everywhere. Now, the vast majority of tree pipits, I'd say about 95% of them, flew straight over. However, a few of them did land, and I was fortunate to see on one occasion some actually on the deck, like this one. Now, this bird actually came down with a flock of about 3 or 4 during quite sort of, it was quite a nice day. It was cloudy, but it was quite calm. And due to a lot of heat the day before, a bit of a sea fog started to form, and the island suddenly got covered in fog within about half an hour. And as a result, these tree pipits obviously were migrating at the time, got a bit lost and sort of panicked, and they dropped in around the farm. It's sort of the highest point on the island, and they were just constantly calling. They were flying around, calling non-stop. I was actually making lunch, and I could actually hear them through the open window, just non-stop tree pipit calls. So I quickly ran out of my camera and luckily managed to get a photo of this one sat on the trig point before it carried on. So obviously, like I said, weather is important. And if you do get a nice clear day that suddenly turns into sort of fog, that quickly can move in, especially on the coast, you can get very quick moving sea fog. It can be quite good to sort of ground birds suddenly. And these birds obviously, it's obviously not good for the birds. You know, they can't see, they can't migrate, they've got to land. But obviously for bird watchers, it does help if you're trying to find things. Now, like the tree pipits, another bird that was mainly recorded flying over and also recorded in very good numbers this year. Here's the graph for tree pipits. So the best day was about 12. So again, blue is August, yellow is September. So again, it's the end of August, the last week of August, first week of September. That is sort of the peak time for a lot of these uncommon migrants. So if you are sort of thinking about visiting somewhere like this, that is the time to visit if you just want to sort of see good numbers of things that you might not normally get to see. It was these guys, so yellow wagtails. It was quite a good year for yellow wagtail. Over 30 recorded, and most mornings they'd be going over, but they were an early bird. Now, that is another big issue with migration. Birds like to move very early. So if you weren't up in the first hour of sunrise, you would miss things. So that first hour, perhaps 2 hours, that was peak time for everything. Everything was flying over. It was busy. And then suddenly you get to midday and then it would just quieten down. It was suddenly, it's like almost like a tap being turned off. It would be really busy. There'd be birds everywhere, you know, be struggling to keep up, and suddenly there'd just be nothing. And that was definitely true with yellow wagtails. Basically, all of them were recorded in the first sort of hour or 2 of sunrise, and most were flyovers. Luckily, this one did stop just about long enough for me to get an okay photo of it. Another bird that sort of isn't really rare, but always nice to see on migration are these red starts. They do seem to be not that common. We only actually managed 3 red starts. They're actually also all males, which is quite unusual. This one, though, was actually quite showy. Spent the day around the farm, actually started fly catching in between people having their picnics. I think a lot of visitors didn't necessarily realise that it was actually a red start that was, sort of stealing food, sort of flies around their face. Unfortunately, though, it picked the worst day to do that. Obviously, it was brought down by the weather, but the weather was awful, so all my photos were a little bit dark. Now, another bird, I obviously keep saying that these birds are quite good years. It did just seem to be quite a good year for sort of these sort of more uncommon migrants. Was Windchat. So Windchat actually also had another record year on Skomer, and they just were everywhere. It was actually amazing how many Windchats there were. So they were recorded on 17 different days. I think they had 67 records. The top day, which we can see in this graph here. So here's Windchat and versus Stonechat. So the top day for Windchat, which is in blue, was the 7th of September, but we actually had an incredible 15 across the island. And that included a flock of about 10 together. So it was really, I think, Skomer's just got perfect habitat, that sort of not much vegetation, but sort of a level sort of wildflower, brackeny habitat. It was sort of perfect for Windchat, and that's shown on their migration. And interestingly, they actually outnumbered Stonechat. So Stonechat do breed on the island as sort of 2 or 3 pairs. So this will sort of indicate these sort of early pairs. So this is starts off in August. So this is early August. You sort of have the odd Stonechat around. You get the odd sort of, these are probably days where there was sort of a lot of juveniles being recorded. So the first Windchat wasn't until the 3rd of September, but then they sort of picked up, and they really picked up in numbers. So a lot of the Stonechats were sort of leaving, sort of the local breeders that bred on the island, sort of dispersing back onto the mainland. And suddenly Windchats were outnumbering Stonechats. And I really enjoyed sort of watching this. And you get the odd mixed flocks. They did like to flock together and get these mixed flocks. For example, on the 12th of September, I think it was, 14th, I apologize. On the 14th of September, we had 12 Windchats on the island and only 5 Stonechats. And there was a flock, I remember, a mixed flock of about 6 Windchats and only 1 Stonechat. But it was, 2 Stonechats and 6 Windchats. So it was really nice to sort of see these sort of mixed flocks where the majority were Windchats and get really nice views of them. Now, I have spoken obviously a lot about these sort of uncommon migrants that pass through during autumn. However, a lot of bird watchers will go to places like Skomer and these sort of migration hotspots on the coast for rarities. And fortunately, this year we were sort of treated to the odd rare bird. That included this guy, Black Kite. Now, this is actually again, it sort of shows that it's worth keeping an eye to the sky, especially for things like Black Kite, whereas a tree pipit or a yellow wagtail will call when it flies over, a Black Kite doesn't. However, you can use gulls. So the gulls actually were mobbing this a lot. I could hear the gulls mobbing. I looked up and I see this really dark bird. It was sort of flying directly towards me. I panicked, ran inside, got the camera. It probably wasn't the best decision, because if I ran back outside and it was gone, I wouldn't have got any record of it. And to be honest, at the time, I wasn't really too sure what it was. Fortunately, I came out of my house with the camera in hand, looked up, and it was directly above my head. And to be honest, I didn't even need to I could identify it with the naked eye. It was that close. It then sort of started to circle. And to make it even better, here's a few other photos of it. Good features to look for are the 5 primaries on the wings, whereas red kite only has 4. The tail is a bit less forked than the red kite. However, unfortunately here, it's sort of started to molt its tail. It's also got this sort of dark mask, which you can kind of see here and also here on both photos. And that's quite sort of stand out with Black Kite. Now, fortunately, the bird sort of started to circle, gain more and more height, whilst getting mobbed by gulls. And luckily drifted back the way it came. So it came in from the mainland and flew back towards the mainland, and luckily flew over the heads of all the other staff members on the island that were on the other side of the island when I saw this over the farm. So luckily everyone got to see it, and that's always nice, when everyone gets to see it. Now, the main reason actually why when I heard the gulls, I kind of panicked and quickly looked at the sky was because it was a really nice sort of summer's day. This was on the 23rd of August. And we were mainly expecting these ospreys. However, that day we didn't actually get any ospreys. It's sort of a clear, nice day, best day for sort of a migrating osprey. This was actually the day after. And it did exactly the same thing the black kite did. It came in from the mainland, went all the way across Skomer, started circling the centre of the island, realised that basically it reached the sea, and decided, actually, no, this is not a good idea. I'm going to go back towards the mainland. And it did seem that a lot of birds of prey were doing this. They sort of fly across the Skomer, follow the coast from the mainland, have a look around, and realise it wasn't really what they were expecting. And we actually managed to get 2 ospreys that day, and they both did exactly the same thing. Now, along with sort of some of the other species I mentioned earlier, like collared dove, another sort of a bird that a lot of people don't necessarily know are migrants, and are perhaps not that exciting normally, but are quite exciting when you're living on an island, are these robins. Now, the first robin, as you can see on this graph, arrived on the 24th of July. Unfortunately, one person saw that and it wasn't seen again. But they started to arrive at the start of August. So after being on the island for a few weeks, not seeing any robins, it was a bit of a, did have a bit of a twitch, I must admit, when a robin turned up on the farm. Everyone came running out to see it. That's something that you wouldn't normally expect if you saw a robin. But on a place like this, you know, they are migrants, and you know, it was the first of the autumn. Their numbers then did really pick up, actually. We got really, really high numbers of robin. Now, I don't want to be too competitive, but interestingly, we did outnumber Skokum on robins quite comfortably on most days. The best day was the 21st of September, where we had 83. And I think Skokum only managed about 60 that day. So perhaps, again, it sort of, you never, and as Skomer is in a bird observatory, so we're not spending our whole time sort of birding compared to other islands. It is interesting to know exactly how many birds are actually out there, because that wasn't necessarily a full island count. However, robins do overwinter, so this graph is a little bit biased because a lot of these birds that arrive will then stay on the island for the whole winter. So you would expect counts to go up and up and up the later you get into the winter. Now, another rarity that arrived just after sort of the black kite, and was this, Icterine warbler. Now, this was actually quite an interesting bird and definitely could teach everyone a lesson. So this was actually, it basically was extremely lucky, and it can show you that a lot of the time it's just luck. That's all that's involved, because basically the assistant warden was out brush cutting, and the brush cutter broke. So I had to go and swap her with another older, sort of smaller brush cutter. So I carried the brush cutter across the island, gave her the other one, and then walked the broken one back. On the way back, I decided to stop off at Morimia at the hide, have a quick sit down in the hide, see if I could see any migrants, because I hadn't been there that day. So I thought it'd be, be good to add it into the bird log in the evening. And I was sat there for about 5 minutes, and suddenly this large warbler appeared. Now, if anyone that hasn't seen an icterine or a melodious warbler, they are quite obvious. Their first impressions are kind of like this large black cat-sized warbler, but more sort of the colour of sort of the willow warbler. They are extremely pale. Now, I saw it, it popped up in front of me, and I went, oh my God, that's either an icterine or a melodious warbler. But again, unfortunately, I didn't have a camera on me. I had no way of knowing that or getting any proof, or also getting any sort of photographic help to ID it, because they are very difficult to ID. So I decided that after watching it sort of very briefly every now and then, I'd quickly go back to the farm and grab my camera. So I walked back across the island, came back about 20 minutes later. The bird came straight back up. So it went out for about half a second, couldn't get the photo in time. It then flew. I went, okay, that's fine. I'll sit in the hide, we'll come back up. 30 minutes later, I'd only seen it twice in flight. So suddenly it became really elusive. But luckily, I actually was about to leave. I decided that I was gonna, instead of sitting in the hide, I was gonna go walk around and stand on the path to try and get a different angle. And as I stood up and sort of opened the hide door, it came out and sat on this branch. And we actually sat there for about sort of 5 minutes. So we ended up getting really nice views of it. Now, if anyone that doesn't necessarily know how you tell icterine from melodious warbler, it's extremely yellow on the chest, whereas melodious warbler wouldn't be that yellow. But it is a juvenile, so juveniles are a lot less yellow anyway. And then this photo, even though it's not the best, does help to indicate. So it seems to have this very long primary projection. So it has a lot of sort of these long wings. And the way I think about it is melodious warblers are sort of found more in Western Europe, so they do breed in France, whereas icterine warblers breed more in sort of Central Europe, a bit further east. So they have longer wings because they've got further to fly to the UK. I don't know if that's a good way of remembering it, but maybe other people might also see. Also, it has this sort of pale wing panel, but it's a bit hard to see, and it's not a reliable feature, but it's another good feature to look out for. Also, some people might have spotted here seems to have a fault bar along its tail, which also helps to identify it as a juvenile. But also, the citrine warbler makes you realize that basically anywhere you are, it's worth spending as much time as possible out in the field because you will miss birds. This bird, I think I saw it about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The next morning, I went at sunrise, spent about 2 hours there. It wasn't there. It is gone. It was gone. It was only there for a day. And if it wasn't for the fact the brush cutter broke, we wouldn't have found it, to be honest. We definitely wouldn't have gone there and we wouldn't have found it. Also, it made me also realize that you should never assume, because at the time there was actually, I think it was something like 4 or 5 melodious warblers in sort of Western Britain. I think Hilborough had one. I think Spardsy had 2 melodious warblers. There was one on Grassholm. Skomer also, I think, might have had one. So basically, I presumed it was going to be a melodious warbler. There was loads turning up in Wales, and sort of, I think there might have been a few in Cornwall as well. There was basically no ictry warblers. However, it turned out to be an ictry warbler. So it does make, always, you never know, basically, in bird watching. Don't ever make any assumptions, and always just, double check. Don't just presume that just because loads of something's turning up, it's going to be that species and not going to be the other version. And now this is actually quite nice, this ictry warbler, because in 2020, the year before, when I was on the island, I was fortunate to see this melodious warbler. So the other one, again, it was a juvenile. You should be able to just about work out that it's sort of got slightly shorter wings, and also got a lot less yellow on the belly, and sort of only got yellow on the head. Here's a sort of a slightly better photo of it. Now this was the complete opposite. So whereas ictry warbler only stayed a day, this actually stayed 6 days. However, it was quite hard to see. So the first day it arrived, it basically the whole day feeding, which suggests it arrived that day. It arrived on the island, it was obviously hungry, it was tired, and basically just non-stop fed. It wasn't really bothered by us. You could get quite nice views of it. We watched it eat caterpillars quite a few times. And then after that, it became really elusive. It wasn't seen, I think, a few days of its 6 days. It was actually seen every day. So, and even though we knew it was there, we just couldn't find it. So there'll be a whole day where we go around trying to find it and it couldn't. And the next day it would reappear again. And it definitely does, again, make you realize how many birds are on islands or in locations that just get missed. Definitely more birds are missed than seen. And so sort of moving on sort of later autumn migration, you get things like these, the gold crest. These arrive a lot later. So the first one was on the 31st of August. And then they sort of increase as you go in September. Now, another bird that we've seen also this year, that unfortunately I didn't actually see, but it's definitely worth mentioning, was on the 9th of September, there was a nightingale. Now, this was found in one of the most unusual places. It was actually found near the coast, near Skomer Head, in basically a small section of bracken. And it was flushed, it seemed quite well in flight as it sort of flew, I think something like 20, 25 meters and then landed again. And it just didn't come back out. Obviously, there's no way of knowing whether or not it was actually a nightingale or a thrush nightingale. But it was, again, we then spent probably about an hour and a half just sat around hoping for it to fly. We knew roughly where it had landed. We knew it must be in this clump of bracken. It just wouldn't. It did not reappear. So it definitely, you never know what gets missed, especially on sort of somewhere like Skomer where there's bracken everywhere. And sort of, again, to expect the unexpected whenever you're bird watching. Now, a bird that Skomer should possibly be more well known for than it is this rhino. Now, the warden of Skomer at the current will probably want you to know that Skomer is actually one of the best places, in his opinion, and perhaps there's some sort of stats to back that up, for wryneck. They are basically annual, and the farm itself, they are also annual. So whereas you get the odd record around the island, basically most of the records are around the farm. Now, there's some argument whether or not that's just because that's where everyone lives. So you're more likely to find birds around the farm. However, it is probably the best habitat for them. However, they are, again, really elusive. And it makes you realize that even though there's not really that much habitat on somewhere like Skomer, these birds can hide away. So this one arrived on the 31st of August, and it was present for about 3 weeks. It seemed to be just always around. However, it just was impossible to see. There was days where nobody would see it. However, fortunately, it decided that it found a very nice pile of ants. However, unfortunately, it was in a very, very small section, sort of a gap in the bracken where there was a bit of bare ground, there's some ant nests next to the path. And unfortunately, you could not see this patch of bracken from anywhere. So this bare bit of ground was basically so well hidden that you only knew the wryneck was there when you walked on the path and flushed it. However, fortunately, it did once actually sit up for me to get one photo of it. But this was probably after about 10 hours. Well, I don't know how many hours I spent just walking around trying to find it, let alone try and get a photo. So though Skomer is a reliable place for wrynecks, especially sort of start of September, the first 2 weeks of September, you basically guarantee that there will be one there. It's just trying to find it. And this went with one the year before. So in 2020, we actually had 2 wrynecks around the farm, at least, possibly 3. So it is a pretty good place for wryneck. So if anyone really wants to see wrynecks, I definitely would recommend Skomer and the start of September. Now, another bird that perhaps you'd be surprised to know that you actually get quite a few of on a treeless island, well, almost treeless, there's no sort of substantial trees, is this great spotted woodpecker. Now, you might think that looks like it's on a tree. It's actually on just a plank of wood that had been sort of raised in the air. No one really knows why that plank of wood's there, but it did act as quite a good perch for the great spotted woodpecker. And weirdly, this was actually found feeding on a cliff face on rocks. So it obviously had fresher in straight onto the island, obviously was tired, landed at its first available opportunity, which was a rock face. Unfortunately, though, it wasn't a wall creeper, and then did finally make its way into the farm where it found the odd tree to peck on. So a few other species to always look out for in sort of the late September are things like these, Skylarks. Now, these used to breed on Skomer. Unfortunately, now they are extinct as of 2017. And we didn't get our first of the autumn until sort of the 20th of September. However, they did start suddenly moving. So we had a bit of bad weather in mid-September. It wasn't really nice. And suddenly it was the first clear day for about a week. And we got 8. And the next day we had 21. So suddenly, if the weather changes, that's a really good time to go out bird watching, because you never know what suddenly might have arrived. Another one is a grey wagtail. So that's also one that does like the nice weather. Now, you might be surprised that I've added a blue tit photo to the talk, though perhaps after the robin earlier, it's less of a surprise. And yes, blue tits are migrants. We got our first one in mid-September on the 14th, and I think we had up to 2 or 3. Weren't really too sure how many there were, but they do fly across. And again, there is sort of theory that middle home, that island in between, acts as kind of a stepping stone, as we do get a lot more tit species than Skokum. But yeah, it's more exciting when you get a blue tit on an island rather than on the mainland. Now, a few wader species just to go through. Lapwing, again, a breeding species, unfortunately, again, extinct. Sort of seems to be the well-known trend that all these sort of species are on a downward trend. It's very sad. But you did get the odd migrant lapwing. Now, this lapwing is on the deck. It was on North Pond, and it was one of very few birds that actually landed, a few wader species that we actually managed to land. So a few other wader species managed. So not. Now, this was our sort of the first good wader of the autumn, sorry. And this is actually quite early. It was on the 18th of July. As you can see, it's still in its summer plumage. It was a very nice looking bird. Unfortunately, it was found very late in the evening. We actually went for a swim late in the evening, and someone managed to spot it on the beach while swimming. It was actually one of the only waders, apart from turnstone, that we actually managed to see on the beach. And by the time I'd managed to sort of get out of the water, dry off, get my sort of camera and scope, it was almost dark. That's why the photo isn't the best, as I tried to digiscope it. Little egret, not actually a wader, but sort of worth mentioning. Get the odd little egret. Used to obviously be extremely rare, and still quite rare on places like Skomer. You don't get that many head out onto the islands. We did get the odd one, and interestingly, this one was found sort of mid-September, and I actually thought it was a seal pup. So we were counting seal pups, and I was like, oh look, there's a new seal pup, and then realised it was a little egret. Redshank. Now, this is one of very few waders that actually landed on the pond. The main reason for this is the pond, though it looks like absolute perfect habitat, it's quite shallow, there's mud all around the outside. It's basically just covered in gulls, loads and loads of gulls, and as a result, it's just not a very nice place for waders. However, this redshank did spend a few minutes sat there before it flew off again. Another wader that you can always look out for is common sandpiper. These actually were quite common. Always seem to get into weird places. I always find it strange when there's common sandpipers, like sort of at the bottom of a cliff face on some rocks. But it does seem to be their sort of well-known habitat on migration. And most of the time, you'd only pick them up by their call. You sort of hear a common sandpiper calling from somewhere down the bottom of the cliff. Now, a nicer, rarer wader as well was this. Now, like I said, not many waders actually landed on the pond. For some reason, this one bucked the trend. So this is a juvenile curlew sandpiper. Quite a rare bird. You don't get too many records on Skomer. And this one actually stayed for half a day. It was there until about 1 o'clock, and it was found at first light. So for some reason, this one bucked the trend. And interestingly, when this curlew sandpiper was here, suddenly other waders started going. So I think it's one of those, the case that there's loads of gulls. The pond doesn't seem very sort of nice to any waders, but once one lands, suddenly more and more that are flying over see that wader and go to join it. So whilst this curlew sandpiper was here, we also had another red shank drop in, and we also had 2 green shanks drop in, which was quite nice. Unfortunately, though, they didn't stay very long, and they were actually scared off after only about 5 minutes. And again, this sort of indicates that the pond was basically empty. Most days you'd go and check it, there'd be no birds on it. And when you did find a bird, it was only there for a few minutes. And again, it sort of reminds people that if you are anywhere bird watching, always spend that extra bit of time. You never know. If you've got a spare hour, just spend it looking at an empty pond, because you never know what's going to land there. And it did work. You know, ring plover, we had them, and they only, I think it only stayed for about 10 seconds. A green sandpiper only stayed for like half a minute. So most of the birds didn't stay for very long. However, if you did spend sort of an hour at the pond, you sometimes were rewarded with something nice. So a lot of the waders we actually did see were flyovers, and here are some of them. So redshank were quite a regular flyover, about 10 redshanks were recorded flying over. Here, it was a good example of how cameras could help bird watchers. So we actually heard a dunlin calling. Dunlin's in the bottom right. I quickly took some photos of 2 waders flying over, and it turned out there was a ring plover with it. So always, you know, if you've got a camera, they can act a really good tool for bird watchers, especially in the modern day. Golden plovers, they were actually quite good. They actually migrate in quite high numbers. We've got about 50 golden plovers and got quite a nice good flocks. Again, these were calling non-stop when they fly over, whereas these black-tailed godwits didn't call. These were silent. So again, sometimes you can get lucky with waders, things like green sandpiper, wimble, redshank, ring plover, golden plover. They were calling continuously, and you'd hear them, and you'd be sort of, you'd know they were there. Whereas certain things like black-tailed godwit didn't call. Now, obviously, for these sort of more common species, it's not the end of the world if you did miss a redshank or you missed a black-tailed godwit. However, some of the rarer species, you know, you need to be very careful. So here are some of the nicer waders that went over. So greenshank, like I said, 2 landed on the pond whilst the curlew sandpiper was there. We did also get another one fly over calling, went straight down the middle of the island. It was extremely loud, actually. Quite a few of us managed to see it. Another one was this. So here's a sort of a selection of photos. And this is a spotted redshank. Best way to tell a spotted redshank, also greenshank actually, in flight from redshank, is the lack of the white trailing edge to the wing. Now this bird was completely silent. It flew luckily right over our heads. But if it wasn't for the fact that, you know, we sort of spotted it flying over our heads, we would have missed it. And it does make you wonder what gets missed. And a lot of days I would just spend them just sort of sat on a bench overlooking sort of half the island, basically just keep an eye on the sky, because that was where most of the birds were. And like I said, cameras can be extremely important for modern day bird watchers, and that can be definitely said for this. So these are absolutely awful photos, and anyone might have worked out this actually is a rough. Now it was again silent. I saw it very distantly flew over. I got my binoculars onto it and went, oh, it's a wader. Quickly grabbed the camera and managed to get some very poor photos that just about managed to identify as a rough. So it's always worth keeping an eye out. Again, a lot of these waders, a bit like the tree pipits and the yellow wagtails, were in sort of the first hour or 2 of sunlight. That seemed to be the perfect, like Skomer, get up early, get out early, you never know what might fly over. And if you're really lucky, you might get something like this. Now, it's not the best photo, but in 2020, I was fortunate to see this fly over. Now, this did call, it was continuously calling. However, I must admit, I did not know the call, I did not know what it was. But luckily you got this very awful photo, and you can just about see sort of a white line here and an orange breast. And this is actually a dotterel. Obviously really nice birds, but you know, if you're lucky, you might end up getting something quite nice like this. Now I was going to quickly talk before we end about seabirds. Now this photo is one of the only photos I've actually got of a skua, that's why I included it. But this year was absolutely awful for sea watching, and that was basically because it was really calm. Now that basically every year, you know, it's different. That's the sort of the joy of sort of being anywhere. Bird watching can be completely different each year. So, you know, last year, 2021, it was really nice weather. We had lots of migrants going through, loads of flycatchers, you know, wind chats, tree pipits, loads of them passing through. But basically no seabirds. There was no wind. We didn't get seabirds. Whereas in 2020, the year before, it was complete opposite. It was really windy every day. There was barely any land migrants, barely any passerby on the island, and basically all the nice things we saw were seabirds. However, there is kind of like sort of a bit of a mistake that people make, that they think that just because you're by the sea, you're going to see seabirds in windy conditions. And that definitely is not the case for Skomer. Skomer isn't the best place for sea watching. And I'm just going to quickly explain why, because I feel like this could be of interest to a few people. So this is sort of the Welsh coast again, Skomer in blue. Now, the best wind normally for Pembrokeshire, especially for sea watching, is sort of this sort of southwesterly south winds blowing things in from the Atlantic up the Irish Sea, sort of in close to the coast where they're close enough to see. So when you get these sort of strong winds, birds will then sort of follow this line outwards, and they'll follow the coast, stay quite close to the coast, use it as a landmark. And that is why places like Strumble Head here does actually quite well on sea watching, because a lot of things will follow it round. So Strumble Head, I think it might be here more, but that does quite well because things will follow the coast and shoot out. However, everything basically misses Skomer. So though you think, you know, Skomer's good, you know, you're on an island out to sea, it's actually not very good for sea watching. And on a bit of a smaller scale, it does happen a little bit. So this is Sept Bay, like I mentioned earlier. You get the same sort of wind, blows things straight into the bay. However, for this to happen, you need a lot stronger winds because birds need to be pushed very close to shore. Whereas on sort of more of a sort of a Wales, a sort of national level, you don't need that much wind to push things relatively close. Whereas to get things into this bay, it needs to be proper strong wind. And again, they'll sort of follow the coast south, and they only really will come close if the wind changes overnight. So the best conditions for Skomer sea watching is a really strong sort of westerly, southwesterly wind that then changes to more of a sort of southwest southerly wind overnight. Birds will then follow the coast and use Skomer as kind of a sort of a shelter. They'll shelter behind Skomer before following it out. However, that said, you can still miss them. So if you sea watch on the west coast of Skomer, which means that you'll have nothing between you and America. It's open ocean as far as you can see. You think, oh, perfect, I can see as much sea as I need to see. You won't see a lot. If you sea watch from the south of Skomer, you'll probably see absolutely nothing. You have to be on the north coast. So this is just a quick reminder that if you are somewhere like this, be very careful, you know, try different places. Don't always sea watch from the same place. Try different coasts. Try different angles, you know, look at the weather. Not all weather is going to be good for sea watching. I think I always remember someone telling me that Fair Isle isn't a very good place for sea watching because it's in the middle of nowhere, and birds do like to follow landmarks. And again, they will follow the coast and then follow it out to an island and then carry on. And as a result, in 2020, we did do quite well on Skomer for sea watching. We managed a Leach's petrel, which was quite nice, quite a few Sabs gulls, sooty shearwater, Balearic shearwater, and about 1,000 terns, which I think those turns in a year because the conditions were just perfect for sea watching. Whereas last year they weren't. So it's sort of, you never really know with something like bird watching. Now, just to end, I'm just going to very briefly talk about some things that I didn't see. Probably isn't the best thing to end on, but you know. So, for example, this. So this might look like a stereotypical flock of jackdaws to you. However, on the bottom left, some of you might have spotted this, a glossy ibis. So obviously, I left the island at the end of September, and the island staff did remain on till October and into a little bit of November. So they obviously did see a few other things, including this, glossy ibis. Again, it was a flyover, didn't land, and sort of indicates that you should always keep an eye on the sky. And again, check anything, you know, they were actually apparently, they were joining up, I think, with the jackdaws a little bit, sort of using the sort of a carrier species, not necessarily what you'd expect. Other species, black redstart. So these are a bit later. So these migrate a lot later than a lot of species. So the first ones weren't until October that we got the first black redstarts. But they did get up to 3 on Skomer, sort of right late in the year. Other birds that they got in sort of October time, Lapland bunting, snow bunting, woodlark. Also got a varmint scoter after I left, unfortunately, and firecrest. Firecrest didn't arrive in October, firecrest. Another species that they got on Skomer this year, which is quite an exciting species, even though it's maybe not that rare to the rest of Wales, is this, jays. Now, I apologise, this isn't the best photo because I did steal it from Twitter. This was taken by the visitor officer, Beth. So it was on the 6th of October that they had a huge influx of jays to the island. Now, a lot of you might be aware that jays had a really good year, basically, in Wales. They had large numbers coming in, and a lot of them were sort of passing on the coast, got really high numbers on the coast, and Skomer did also get its sort of fair share. So on the 6th of October, they had roughly 101 jays on the island, including a single flock of 60. Now, obviously, it's really nice to see rare birds like Ictrian warblers, black kites, things like that. However, sometimes it isn't necessarily the rarities that sort of snatch the headlines and the most memorable. I feel like if I was there when there's a flock of 101 jays, that would be a pretty cool thing to see, especially when there's not many trees on the island. Now, I don't necessarily know exactly what caused it, though I do know Julian Hughes is writing a paper. So if anyone is interested of actually learning why there was this sudden massive influx of jays, especially those on the coast, definitely look out for his paper. But again, Skomer definitely did do well because of that middle home island. That middle home being a bit close to the mainland was enough to get the jays to come across, whereas Skomer didn't actually record any. So it's not that, it's only about a mile further out to sea, but it didn't get any. Now, very briefly to end, thanks for letting me have your time. I'm just going to very briefly talk about, I know it's mentioned at the start, what I'm currently working with, mainly because I did leave sort of a bit early from work in London today to get home to do this. So I thought I'd make my bosses happy and include this. So I'm currently working for a bird watching app called Birder. Now, it is very new. It's been on the App Store for Apple users since roughly December time, but only been on for Android users for the last couple of weeks. So a couple of weeks ago it came out. So it's a very new app. And basically, think Strava for bird watching. So basically, you can record your sightings live, and it will use your exact locations to plot exactly where you see things and the exact time whilst out bird watching. There's also a much more of a social aspect. So our aim is to try and get sort of more people into bird watching and sort of maybe change the way people bird watch and the way people sort of perceive bird watchers. So maybe slightly different to maybe sort of stuff like Bird Track and eBird. There's challenges, you can gain badges for seeing certain things, and there's also a feed. So there's a kind of like a Twitter or Instagram feed where after you do a session, you can sort of submit your sightings onto the feed. People can like your sightings, they can comment on your sightings, you can have photos, and it sort of makes it a bit more sort of interactive. And in a way, for me, it kind of saves that time of having to add something to Bird Track and then having to sort of then post on Twitter to sort of, or post into a WhatsApp group. So hopefully, it will hopefully perhaps come sort of a one app for everything. Now it's up to you whether or not you want to download it or not, but it is free to download. And if anyone does have any sort of spare time at the weekend and sort of want something to do, I would advise sort of downloading, seeing what you think. We're always looking for sort of any new suggestions. It's very new. We're hoping to add lots of new features over the next few weeks. So if anyone does sort of have any free time, I would really recommend sort of downloading it. Even though I work for the company, I do really like the app and think it could be going somewhere and could definitely fill a gap that sort of isn't currently really being filled at the moment. So thank you for your time. I will be happy to answer any questions if anyone does have any. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. That was brilliant. Are there any quick questions for Ed this evening before we come to an end?
Did you go out many evenings looking for the Manx shearwaters when they were coming in?
Yeah, a little bit, but yeah, they basically it's really easy. There's thousands. So any evening you go out, they cover the path. So it's really cool. But obviously after a while, you sort of, I wouldn't say you get bored of them, but I mainly want to get a light and sort of go to bed early to get up early to start looking for other things. Yeah. But yeah, if anyone really wants to see Manx shearwaters, it's one of the best places to see them. They're just everywhere.
Do people ever get hit by them when they're coming in when it's gone dark?
Yeah, quite a lot. I got hit a few times.
Oh, really?
think the worst one was when one flew straight at me along the path. So it was like the path, was sort of walking towards it, expecting it to fly off, and for some reason it decided to fly straight at us and hit me.
Right. Okay. Excellent.
Not sure why. Not the best survival strategy for a Manx shearwater to fly at a predator, but
yeah, they're not very good at banking.
No.
Any other questions for Ed this evening?
There's a question in the chat from Rachel. She would like to know if she can volunteer for a week, and she said, "Amazing talk, thanks."
Yeah, so I did sort of mention it very briefly at the start, but they take 6 weekly volunteers, and you have to apply in September. I think deadlines close at the end of September, so they're only open for a month, so it is a bit sort of short. So if you are looking to volunteer, they do obviously need a lot of volunteers. It's 6 a week for the whole season, but you do have to get your application form in September. So if you are looking, sort of have a look out in September. But if you're really, really keen, I definitely would just recommend emailing and seeing if there is sort of any gaps that they can fill. Because I know that sometimes, especially outside the seabird season, not many people want to volunteer because a lot of people want to just come and volunteer when the puffins are there. But yeah, I definitely would recommend it.
Well, Ed, I think your talk has been recommendation tonight. That's for sure. Thank you very much indeed. You really immersed us in that island, just like you were immersed on a couple of occasions, and it really came through tonight. I mean, it's obviously an island. With the largest
Sorry, Nigel, you're breaking up a bit
so
there.
many other interesting, because okay, I'm very sorry, but I'll keep it short. But the main thing I want to say is that yeah, that was a really intimate, insular insight into a fascinating island. Wales is blessed with several such islands, and I hope everybody listening and watching tonight will have the chance to go to one of these islands in the near future, because it is an exceptional experience, as I think we've felt tonight from what Ed has told us about Skomer. The same is true of Bardsey and other islands. It's just a fabulous opportunity to get to grips and feel the raw sense of birds, whether they're resident or migrating, and just that in-depth knowledge of a relatively small part of the bird's world day in, day out is just fascinating. Wonderful to see how it's all logged so carefully to give a really proper objective insight into what's going on in any one year, and then being able to compare it from year to year. I just love that about these island observatories. They are unique in their density of detail, of natural history observation. And this was an exemplar of it this evening. Thank you for providing us with so many identification details, for alerting us to have open minds about what we see and what might be around. Always be ready for the surprises. That came over really well. And beautiful images. They really complemented everything you were saying. And I think what was great was that the images ranged from superb professional style portraits to those that really reflected the speed with which you had to act to see the bird or get some identification opportunities. And that's all part of the joy of bird watching, and particularly on an island, because you know you ain't going to have another chance as it flies off into the distance over to the mainland or wherever. So all that came across brilliantly, Ed. Thank you very much for tonight's talk. We've been treated yet again by another former student. You've done us proud, and Bird Group wishes you all the very best, first of all, with this new app, which sounds great. I wouldn't have a clue how to work it, but I think from what you've explained, it sounds like the next step up for exciting bird watching and interaction. I hope it's successful for you and for the firm. And also, of course, with your time on Bardsey this coming season. I hope it's a really successful season for you and for Bardsey with the birds, etc. So, diolch yn fawr iawn. That was a great talk. And on behalf of us all, thank you.